The big question. Prior to the arrival of Europeans, how did the habitat of the Pacific Northwest influence the culture of local Native American tribes? What do you imagine when you think of a rainforest? Perhaps you imagine a hot, humid place with heavy vegetation and trees filled with exotic parrots and monkeys. You might also imagine snakes and all sorts of bugs. It is true that most rainforests are steamy jungles located in tropical regions of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. However, not all rainforests are in the tropics. Some rainforests grow in the temperate zone, where the weather is never too hot or too cold, but it is often very wet. The Pacific Northwest region includes much of Washington State and Oregon, plus the western flank of Canada called British Columbia. Temperate rainforest blankets the coastal parts of this region. The steady rains and mild temperatures are perfect for plant growth. Spruce, hemlock, and fir trees can reach heights of 300 feet or more. Beneath the dense treetop canopy, the forest floor is a carpet of thick mosses, fluffy ferns, and lichens. The climate is good for animal life, too. There are hundreds of different bird and fish species. There are at least 140 different mammals, including some very large elk, bighorn sheep, mountain lions, gray wolves, and the occasional grizzly bear. Fishing for salmon. The Pacific Northwest is also a good habitat for humans. By some estimates, Native Americans have lived there for as many as 500 generations, or 15,000 years. The area was once home to at least 30 tribes, hundreds of villages, and a huge variety of languages, customs, and beliefs. All the tribes had a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but they did not need to move around in order to find food. They lived in large, permanent villages. They did not need to farm either. Everything they needed was readily available in the forests and waters. As long as they respected those resources, then there was always enough to go around. In fact, there was usually more than enough for everyone. A very important food source for most tribes was salmon. They could always depend on salmon to swim up the rivers every year. One important thing to know about salmon is that they are born in rivers, but they live most of their lives at sea. When they are adults, they return from the sea and swim back up the rivers to the very same places where they were born. There, they lay their eggs and die. The eggs hatch, the baby salmon find their way to the sea, and the cycle continues. The other important thing to know about salmon is that they are very nutritious. The people of the Pacific Northwest certainly knew this, and they became master fishermen. Some tribes fished using baskets, nets, spears, or harpoons, and a variety of ingenious traps to catch salmon. However, salmon are only available to catch in the rivers for a few months each year, when they return to lay their eggs. For the remainder of the year, they are in the ocean. Therefore, if you depend on salmon for food, you will have to supplement your diet. Native American men in this region hunted the big mammals that roamed the rainforests. Women gathered roots, berries, and grains, including wild rice. Many tribes went after other types of fish, as well as whales and seals, the mammals of the sea. The whale hunters. One tribe, the Makah, were famous whalers. They used long, fast canoes to chase whales in the rough Pacific waters, and they killed them with long, sharp harpoons. This is how they hunted huge gray whales and humpbacks, which can weigh up to 80,000 pounds, about the same as 4 school buses. Imagine hunting a creature that size from the front of a canoe with a harpoon. This was very dangerous work, but it was worth the risk because one whale could feed a whole village for months. After they killed a whale, the hunters towed it to shore, and the whole village would come out to help cut up the meat, salt it, and hang it up to dry. This preserved the meat for later use. Just as Plains tribes used all parts of the buffalo, Pacific Coast tribes used the whole whale. They took oil from the whale's blubber to use for cooking, tanning hides, or covering wounds and bug bites. Whale oil was also valuable in trade to inland tribes. Bones were used to make scrapers, fish hooks, and other tools. The Makah were, and still are, expert whalers. The power of the totem. Like other Native Americans, the people of the Pacific Northwest did not take anything for granted. After they hunted any animal, whether it was a salmon, whale, elk, or anything else, they always welcomed its spirit into their village and thanked it for helping them. People felt a direct connection to other living things, and they expressed this connection through their religion. Tribes of the Pacific Northwest practiced a form of religion called Totemism. They believed that people shared special bonds with animals, as though their spirits were connected. Every family had a bond with a specific animal spirit. This animal was the family's totem. In many tribes, totems were displayed on colorful, artistic wood carvings. Some people placed a tall totem pole outside the family home. Others passed a sacred mask down from generation to generation. The totems were not simply for decoration. They were symbols of something far more significant than a fancy wood carving. A totem was the key to a family's identity. Just as every animal has its own unique traits, so too did a totem have unique meaning for the family. Some totems were big, fierce animals like the bear, wolf, or eagle. Others were gentler animals like the beaver or seal. The size or strength of the animal was not as important as the stories and characteristics of the animal. For instance, beavers were symbols of determination, wolves were symbols of loyalty, whales represented wisdom, and spiders represented creativity. Totem pole. In some tribes, a family could not hunt, eat, or otherwise harm its totem animal. Not all totems were animals, though. Some family totems were related to other parts of nature, like the rivers, the wind, or the sun and moon. Some totems included mythical creatures and monsters, like the powerful thunderbird or the two-headed sea serpent. Each symbol and the stories related to it were passed from generation to generation, so they carried special meaning for the family. Clans and the Potlatch. The social structure of Pacific Northwest tribes was centered around large extended families called clans. Clans lived in spacious homes called plank houses, long, narrow buildings made of cedar planks. As many as 50 or more people could live in one plank house. A single tribe or village had many clans, and although they all worked together and shared their resources, some clans were much wealthier than others. The head of a clan was a chieftain, and the wealthiest chieftains were very powerful. Most importantly, they had the power to decide who was allowed to hunt, fish, or gather foods in certain places. A plank house could hold as many as 50 people. Perhaps the most distinct and interesting tradition among tribes of the Pacific Northwest was the potlatch ceremony. A potlatch was basically a huge party. Every tribe had different rituals and rules about how to celebrate a potlatch, but they all had the same basic purpose: to display someone's wealth. Only the richest chieftains hosted potlatches, often to celebrate or mark a birth, death, marriage, or other important event within the clan. Wealthy chieftains had special plank houses specially built just for potlatches. The richer the host, the bigger the potlatch. Sometimes they invited the whole village, along with chieftains from wealthy clans in other villages. A potlatch could last for days or even several weeks, depending on the host's wealth and tribal customs. There were lavish feasts, storytelling and speeches, and lots of singing and dancing. Potlatches also involved important, secretive religious rituals. However, gift-giving was always the main feature. In fact, the word potlatch means giving, and this is the unique thing that separates potlatches from other Native American ceremonies. The potlatch host did not give gifts just because he was kind and generous. The gifts were a display or expression of his power and wealth. Gifts included blankets, animal hides, and shiny copper ornaments. Ordinarily, the hosts did not give food as gifts, although they did supply food for the feasts. Wealth among the people of the Pacific Northwest was not measured by how much someone owned, but by how much they gave away to others. Chieftains also used potlatches to award ranks or seats to their friends and family members. This is how people in the tribe moved up the social ladder. The closer a person's seat was to the chieftain, the more power and privilege that person had within the clan. Blankets, copper bracelets, hide. A potlatch could last for days. In some tribes, they not only gave away their wealth, they also destroyed it. They built great bonfires and burned the gifts to show that they were so wealthy they did not need any of it. Potlatches created competition among the various chieftains. If a chieftain went to a potlatch and received gifts from another chieftain, then he was expected to host a potlatch and give even more gifts. If one chieftain burned a big pile of blankets and animal hides at his potlatch, then the other chieftains would hold potlatches and burn even more blankets and hides. In this way, the amount of gift-giving always increased, as each chieftain tried to make his potlatch bigger than the last. European contact. With European contact, tribes of the Pacific Northwest suffered many of the same problems as tribes in other regions. Disease and warfare spread quickly, and by the mid-1800s the populations were greatly reduced. Tribes lost access to their traditional fishing and hunting grounds as miners, loggers, and other settlers moved into the region. One after another, the tribes were forced onto small reservations, or their numbers dwindled. Sometimes gifts were burned. For many years, potlatches were outlawed by the U.S. government. They did not understand why Native Americans destroyed such valuable resources. Sometimes the potlatch hosts even melted and destroyed copper coins they earned through trade with the settlers. This seemed very foolish and wasteful to outsiders. In many cases, Native Americans were also forbidden from displaying their sacred totems because settlers believed these were connected to some kind of witchcraft. To the tribes of the Pacific Northwest, the potlatches and totems were the heart of their culture and identity. Without them, the people lost their connection to the past, and they struggled to understand their own purpose or place in the world. Despite this, many tribes in the Pacific Northwest held on to their traditions. They still pass totems from one generation to the next. They still share their ancient myths and stories about ancestors and animal spirits. And in some places, they still host potlatches to celebrate the great events in life and all the gifts of nature. Modern potlatch ceremony.